Before the ashes had memories, there was a whisper. A whisper that crept through the ancient cathedrals of Prague, lurked in the spice markets of Amsterdam, and echoed in the dusty libraries of Warsaw. It was not spoken of, but passed on with a glance, with a discreet clasp of the hand. They called it the Black Butterfly List, a cursed catalogue, not of the dead, but of those who would shape the post-war world. The names of the scientists, the artists, the thinkers whom the Nazis sought not to kill, but to enslave. And most importantly, the names of the traitors within the Allies, those who would sell out the future for power. It was not written on paper, but encoded in the memories of a select few, the butterfly keepers. Our story does not begin with a Jewish girl. It begins with the moment she became the last watchman. She was born into a world that seemed eternal. The cobblestone streets of Holland, where the smell of baking bread mingled with the scent of tulips, were her universe. Her family, like many Jewish families, lived by a calendar of knowledge and tradition. Her father was more than a merchant. He was a lover of books, a man who believed that history was written in ink, not blood. They had naively believed that the walls of the library could shield them from the political storm rising from the east. But that storm wanted more than land. It wanted souls. In January 1933, as Adolf Hitler tightened his iron grip on Germany, the whispers became more urgent. The Nuremberg laws were more than just a stripping of citizenship. They were an intellectual purge, an attempt to erase the memory of an entire people. The butterfly families began to flee, taking pieces of the list with them. Some went to Switzerland. Some tried to cross the Atlantic. Her family stayed, believing in the neutrality of the Netherlands, a fragile fortress against the madness. The girl, then 12 or 13, was still absorbed in books, unaware that every name she read, every story she memorized, was part of her training. Her father taught her poems, songs, complex chemical formulas. These were not ordinary lessons. They were codes. And then darkness fell across the border. In May 1940, the Germans entered the Netherlands. The peace was shattered. The yellow Star of David they were forced to wear was more than a badge of shame. It was a target. For the Nazis, it was a way to mark their prey. But for those hunting the Black Butterfly List, it was a way to identify the sentience. Her life shrank. No parks, no cinemas, no libraries. Her world became four walls. And books now carried a deadly weight. Her father would sit with her at night, not telling her fairy tales, but telling her about people who would change the world, making her repeat their names, their works, their secrets. He didn't say she was learning a list. He said she was breeding butterflies in her mind. By the summer of 1942, the truth was inescapable. The deportation order had been issued. The cattle trains began rolling east to what the Nazis called labor camps. But her family knew they were death factories. The night before they were arrested, her father held her tight. He didn't say goodbye. He whispered a series of numbers and a final phrase in her ear, a code that activated everything she had learned. When the sun is gone, you will be the last butterfly. The moment the knock came on the door, her childhood ended. She was no longer a little girl. She had become a living archive, a secret that both sides in the most brutal war in history wanted. Her journey on the train to Auschwitz was more than a journey to death. It was a race to protect a forbidden legacy, a legacy that could save or destroy the world to come. Time died in the cattle car. It did not move. It just solidified into a suffocating mass of darkness and sweat and fear. Outside, the world was a clatter of wheels on rails, a rhythm that carried them to the depths of hell. But inside the girl's mind, time was running. It ran backward, forward, in a mad dance of memory. Each name on the Black Butterfly Index was a heartbeat, each scientific work a breath. She no longer felt hunger or thirst. Her body was a shell, a rickety vessel carrying a priceless cargo. She recited the poems, the songs, the chemical formulas her father had carved into her mind. It was a memory palace, and she was fortifying its walls before the storm came. And then the storm came. A deafening metallic screech, the train doors were torn open. Light poured in, cruel and blinding. The air outside was not the air of life, but a strange, sweet smell, the the smell of burning flesh and chemicals, a smell that would haunt her dreams forever. Shouts in harsh German, dogs barking, the cries of children being torn from their mothers. It was Auschwitz-Birkenau. But she did not see a labor camp. She saw a sick library where people were books, stripped of their contents, leaving only numbered leather covers. They were pushed into a long, endless line. Men on one side, women and children on the other. The selection, a wave from a white-robed SS officer, cold as an angel of death, would decide who would go to forced labor and who would go straight to the gas chambers. The line moved forward, each step a beat in her chest. She saw old people, mothers with small children, pushed to the left, toward the chimneys that were belching black smoke into the gray sky. Her heart clenched, but her mind was cold. Her father's code rang out, "When the sun in the east is gone." She had to live, not for herself, but for the butterflies in her mind. She straightened, pinching her cheeks to make them flush, trying to look strong and helpful. But when it was her turn, her eyes were not fixed on the SS doctor pointing with his baton. Her gaze was drawn to a figure standing further back, in the shadow of the watchtower. He was not wearing a doctor's white uniform, but the jet-black uniform of a high-ranking officer, with a skull on the collar. He was not concerned about the prisoners' health. He was reading them. His steely eyes scanned each face, searching not for weakness or strength, but for a different light, a sign of knowledge, of concealment. Sturmbannführer Kressler, the memory hunter. The name her father had whispered one stormy night, a demon in the guise of a scholar, the one tasked with tracking down the black butterfly list. For a moment that seemed like an eternity, their eyes met. She saw a cold curiosity in his eyes, the appraisal of a collector examining a rare object. He frowned slightly. She immediately ducked her head, letting her hair cover her face, trying to make herself invisible, a sheep in the flock. But it was too late. She knew he had seen something. "Right," the SS doctor snapped, and she was pushed toward temporary life. She had passed the first gate. But as she was herded away with the other women, she glanced back. Kressler was still standing there, his eyes fixed on her, a barely perceptible smile playing across his lips. He didn't know who she was, but he could smell her. She had survived the selection, but she had walked straight into an even more elaborate trap. Her fight would not be fought in minefields or trenches. It would be fought in the labyrinths of Auschwitz, a deadly game of chess between a girl who held the secrets of the world and a monster who hunted those secrets. The game had truly begun. They shaved off her name along with her hair. They tattooed an iron cocoon on her left arm, A7713. The number was not a new identity. It was the destruction of the old one. But the girl did not feel any loss. She felt a strange, cold relief. A7713 was the perfect camouflage. Under this number, engraved in eternal blue ink, she could hide the butterflies that fluttered in her memory palace. This anonymous shell was the strongest shield. Camp life was a machine designed to crush the soul. The pre-dawn roll calls, which lasted hours in the bitter cold, where the frozen core were lined up neatly next to the living. The thin soup was barely enough to sustain a faint existence, not life. And the work. Endless, meaningless work. From carrying rocks from place to place and back again, to digging ditches that led nowhere. All part of a brutal ritual designed to turn people into soulless puppets. But then, one day, her number was called. She was not sent to a construction site or a mine. She was sent to a place the prisoners called, both ironically and longingly, Canada. It was a vast warehouse, filled with the belongings of millions of people who had stepped off trains and headed straight for the gas chambers. Canada was the Everest of plunder, a mountain of stolen lives. Silk dresses, children's toys, family photo albums, warm violins. Her job was to sort through them, separating the gold from the clothes, sorting out the valuables to send back to Germany. She understood quickly. This was no random assignment. This was Kressler's chessboard. He had placed her at the center of the world's largest archive of Jewish memory. Here, amid millions of silent testimonies, he could watch her. Every object she touched was a trap. A letter written in Yiddish, a book of Spinoza's philosophy, a volume of scientific manuscripts. He was waiting for a sign, a pause, a glance that lasted longer than a split second that would signal recognition. The capo in Canada were more brutal than elsewhere. They were Kressler's eyes and ears, bloodhounds fed privileges to sniff out secrets. She learned to work like a machine. Her hands moved, but her mind was locked. She threw wedding photos into the fire without blinking. She tore up diary pages to clean a pair of leather shoes for an SS officer. Each action was a small stab to her soul, but she knew it was worth it. One gloomy afternoon, as she sorted through an old leather suitcase, her hand touched a book. It was a volume of poetry by Heinrich Heine, her father's favorite. Her heart stopped. She knew it was a test. She slowly opened the book. Between the pages was a small portrait of a bearded man with wise, sad eyes. She knew him. His name, a brilliant physicist from Vienna, was one of the brightest butterflies in her mind. In the corner of the room, a female capo was watching her, her eyes fixed on her. The universe held its breath. A cold sweat ran down her spine. She could feel Kressler's invisible presence, as if he were standing right behind her, whispering devilish enticements. The slightest movement and the game would be over. And then, with a will she didn't know she had, she did the unthinkable. She stared at the photo, then looked up at the capo, a frown of disgust on her face. Then, slowly, she tore the photo in half, crumpled it, and threw it into the trash bin. She turned to the page with the poem her father had read to her every night, tore it out, used it to wipe the mud off a porcelain vase, and threw that away too. The capo turned away, seemingly satisfied. She had passed the test, but as she continued her work, her hands shook uncontrollably. She had survived, but she had just destroyed a part of her own memory. She realized the cruel rule of Kressler's game. To protect the garden of memories within, she had to turn the outside world into a desert. She had to become a saboteur, a desecrator of what was most sacred to her. Hell was not all barbed wire and crematoriums. Hell was when, to save the souls of humanity, you had to sell your own soul, piece by piece. In Auschwitz, kindness was a dangerous currency. Giving a piece of bread could starve you, but taking it could lock you into an unpayable debt. So the girl built ever higher walls around her mind. She became a ghost, a figure who glided through the barracks, eyes downcast, never meeting the eyes of any prisoner or guard. Every prisoner could be a spy. Every word of comfort could be a trap. Kressler was too smart to rely solely on the brutal capos. He must have planted more subtle informants, who used empathy as a weapon. This isolation almost killed her, not from hunger but from emptiness. Until one day Elara appeared. Elara was not like the others. She was a Polish political prisoner, a doctor from Krakow, with eyes that had seen too much, but whose fire of wisdom had not yet been extinguished. Elara did not give her bread. Instead, in the dingy infirmary, while dressing an ulcer on her leg, she whispered a line from Rilke in German, a line about solitude and strength. The girl did not answer, but Elara knew she understood. Their silent dialogue began like this: not with words, but with literary quotations, historical references, mathematical formulas scribbled in the dust and erased. Elara never asked about her past, never tried to penetrate her fortress. She simply built a bridge of knowledge, to her isolated island. The girl gradually realized that Elara was part of something larger, a secret resistance network within the camp. They had no weapons. Their weapon was information. They memorized the names of SS officers, recorded the arrival of trains, tried to smuggle bits of news to the outside world. They were the historians of hell. Their existence filled her with a glimmer of hope, but also with a deep fear. If Kressler found out, the entire network would be destroyed. She remained at a distance, an ally from afar, never conceding anything. Hers was still a solitary game. But Kressler was losing patience. His elaborate traps in Canada had failed. He decided to use a blunter but far more effective tool: pure terror. A sudden selection was announced to the entire women's camp. This time, the person in charge was none other than Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death. His name was whispered in utter horror. He did not just choose people for the gas chambers. He chose test subjects for his inhumane research, especially twins and those with unusual physical characteristics. As thousands of naked women were herded onto the field for roll call, the girls saw him, Kressler. He stood beside Mengele, not as a participant, but as an honored spectator, a demon whispering into another demon's ear. Her heart sank. This was no longer a test. This was a staged execution. Kressler was using the chaos and the sheer terror Mengele had created to break her shell. He believed that in the face of random and brutal destruction, the true nature of his prey would be revealed. The line moved forward. Mengele walked down the line, baton in hand, whistling an operatic tune, his blue eyes scanning the trembling bodies. He gestured to a red-haired girl, a pair of twin sisters. They were dragged out of the line, their screams drowned out by the horrified silence of the others. As Mengele drew closer, the girl felt Kressler's eyes burning into her. This was the moment of reckoning. At that moment, in the jostling of the crowd, Ilara squeezed herself in beside her. She didn't look at her, just stared straight ahead, her lips barely moving. "Kressler's sister died of typhus," she whispered, quick as lightning. He feared it more than bullets. The information was like a knife pressed into her hand in the darkness, a specific, deadly detail. It wasn't encouragement. It was a weapon. Mengele stopped just a few feet away from her. He smiled, a smile that froze the blood in her veins. Kressler was watching, waiting for her to collapse. The girl had a piece of intelligence in her hands that could change her fate, but how to use it? Any action could be suicide. She took a deep breath, the smell of death filling her lungs. She was no longer a bookkeeper. She had to become a warrior, using the only weapon she had, a lie built on a forbidden truth. There was no time for a plan. Only instinct and a whisper from Ilara, cold as a knife. Mengele's blue eyes scanned her, a gaze both curious as a scientist and repulsive as a butcher exa, mining a piece of meat. He was searching for perfection in the abnormal. Twins, a birth defect, something to satisfy his morbid curiosity. The girl was completely normal, and in this situation, normality could be a death sentence. But she wasn't aiming at Mengele. Her target was the figure standing behind him. She needed to send a message, not to the doctor, but to the hunter. She took a deep breath and began the performance of her life. First there was a shiver not only from the cold, but also from a slight, almost imperceptible twitching of the muscles. Then she let her eyes lose focus, becoming dull and glassy, as if a high fever was brewing inside. She did not cough, did not moan. The silence was more terrifying. And then she made the decisive move. With a slow, almost unconscious movement, she raised her hand to her left arm, right up to the number A7713, and began to scratch. A light scratch, then more forceful. The instinctive action of someone bitten by lice, the parasites that carried typhus. Mengele noticed immediately. His amusement turned to scrutiny. He took a step forward, his baton tilting her chin up. "Look at me," he commanded. Her heart felt like it was bursting in her chest. But she didn't look at him. She looked past his shoulder, into the space where she knew Kressler stood. And she saw it. For the first time, she saw a crack in Sturmbannführer Kressler's steel armor. When his eyes caught sight of her scratching, his thin lips pressed together. He took half a step back involuntarily. It was only half a step, a reflex that was almost invisible. But to the girl, it was as big as an earthquake. His fear was real. His disgust for disease, for filth, was stronger than his SS discipline. It was Kressler, not her, who made the final decision. His retreat, the subtle change in the atmosphere, was transmitted to Mengele. The angel of death did not want a damaged test subject. His curiosity vanished, replaced by contempt. He let go of her chin as if he had touched something filthy. "Unrein," he muttered. "Unclean." With a wave of disgust, he dismissed her, pushing her back into the crowd of the living. She staggered back, her heart still pounding. She had lived. She had looked into the eyes of a demon and used another demon's fear as a weapon. As the brutal selection continued behind her, she found Ilara in the crowd, a small, almost imperceptible nod was all they exchanged. The debt was paid. But as she returned to the cell block, the relief quickly gave way to a colder feeling. She had won the battle, but perhaps she had lost the war. Her performance had been perfect. A normal prisoner would have screamed, begged, or been paralyzed with fear. She had acted with cold calculation. Kressler, once his initial fear had passed, would analyze every moment. He would see the subtlety of her actions. He would no longer doubt. He would know for sure. She had survived, but she had turned over her cards. She had shown the hunter that his prey was not a frightened deer, but a cunning fox. The hunt would no longer be about traps and distant observation. It would be more direct, more ruthless, more personal. That night, lying on the hard wooden bed, she did not feel the presence of death in the camp. She felt Kressler's eyes, piercing the wooden walls, piercing the darkness, piercing her mind, where butterflies fluttered in fear. The game had entered a new phase, far more dangerous. After Mengelé's selection, the brutality of Auschwitz changed for her. It was no longer a mindless machine, an automated killing system. Now it had a name and a face, Kressler. Her fear was no longer abstract, it became personal. She was not just fighting for survival in an extermination camp. She was being hunted by a concrete mind, an enemy who knew the value of what she was protecting. The next few months passed in a haze of intense tension. Kressler no longer used obvious traps. He began a psychological war. He had her transferred from Canada to a more meaningless but less supervised job, cleaning the SS officers' quarters. It was a masterful and cruel move. He placed her at the very center of his power, forcing her to pass through his office every day, breathing the same air as him. He wanted her to get used to his presence, to wear down her defenses through repetition. Occasionally, he would leave the door to his office open as she passed. She could hear classical music, Wagner, of course, streaming from the room. She could see the mahogany bookshelves filled with the philosophical works her father had loved. It was a refined form of torture, a reminder of the intellectual world he had appropriated and corrupted. Then one day he called her in, not for questioning, no guards, no truncheons, just him, sitting behind a polished wooden desk and a steaming porcelain cup of tea. The room was disgustingly warm, insultingly clean. It was an oasis of false civilization in a sea of barbarism. "Sit down, A7713, he said, his voice even. "I thought you might need some warmth." She stood still, her heart pounding against her chest like a caged bird. She had been prepared for the whip, for the torture, but not for this. This false kindness was more dangerous than any form of violence. He did not ask her about her past, her family, or anything else that might reveal secrets. Instead, he spoke of Plato, of the world of ideas, of how human memory is an imperfect copy of eternal truth. He was probing her, using philosophy like a scalpel, trying to find a chink in her intellectual armor. Her only response was silence, her face expressionless, her eyes empty. He smiled, undeterred. He stood and walked over to a glass case on the wall. Inside, carefully pinned to black velvet, was a collection of butterflies. He pointed to a particular butterfly in the center, a rare jet-black Apollo, its wings woven from the night. "Beautiful, isn't it?" His voice was almost gentle. "It's a tragedy that something so fragile can carry such a heavy weight, such a burden." The air in the room froze. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He knew. He might not know the details, but he knew about the butterfly keepers. Her father's words echoed in her head. "You are the last butterfly." She stared at the pinned insect, the symbol of her own fate. Then she slowly raised her head, looking Kressler straight in the eyes. Her voice came out, flat and lifeless like the rustling of dry leaves. "To me," she said, "it's just a dead insect." A tense silence fell. It was her final challenge, a complete rejection not only of her mission, but of his entire worldview. Kressler's smile didn't fade, but his eyes cooled 10 degrees. He had his answer. "You may go," he said. As she turned, her hand on the doorknob, his voice spoke again, not to her, but to himself, to history. The war is almost over. The archives will soon change hands. Some insects need to be preserved. The door slammed behind her, but his words echoed. She understood the real threat. Kressler no longer wanted to break her for information. He wanted to possess her. He wanted to capture her alive as an archive, an intellectual trophy to take with him when the Third Reich collapsed, perhaps to sell to a new power. Allied liberation was no longer a hope. It had become a countdown. She did not just have to survive Auschwitz. She had to escape it before Kressler could preserve her. The war was no longer about enduring. It had become a race against time. For most of the prisoners at Auschwitz, the sound of cannon fire from the east was a symphony of hope. For her, it was the ticking of a time bomb. Each distant explosion, signaling the advance of the Red Army, was a tick of the clock that shortened her time. Liberation was coming, but Kressler would get there first. The camp descended into controlled chaos. The Nazis began their final rush, killing the remaining Jews while frantically erasing evidence. The crematoria were turned on full blast, then destroyed. Files were burned, creating a shower of blackened ash, a funeral pyre for history itself. The SS guards, once omnipotent rulers, were now irritable and frightened. Their fear made them all the more dangerous. She knew she could not wait. The time for silence and observation was over. She had to act. One night, in a crowded, stifling cell, she found Ilara. There were no more poems or code words. She looked the Polish woman straight in the eyes, and in a hushed whisper she told the truth. Not about the Black Butterfly List, but about Kressler's hunt. He won't let me survive the liberation, she said. He wants me for something else. Ilara listened, her face, already lined with grief, hard as stone. She did not appear surprised. Her network knew about Kressler, the ghost of the archives. "We have a plan," Ilara replied, her voice firm. "Not an uprising. It is suicide. Our plan is annihilation." She explained that when the final evacuation order was given, when tens of thousands of prisoners were herded out of the camp in death marches, it would be the most chaotic moment, the only chance for a few to slip into the shadows. She took the girl's hand, a cold but powerful grip. "Be prepared. When the evacuation order is given, go to the infirmary. Don't ask why." Weeks passed in tense anticipation, and then, on a snowy January afternoon in 1945, the order came. Evacuate! Screams, curses, gunshots in the air. The prisoners were herded out of the buildings, herded into endless lines, beginning their journey into white death. The Death March. Amid the chaos, the girl looked for Kressler, and she found him. He was not involved in the mass evacuation. He was standing next to a black staff car, flanked by a small group of SS elite. He was not marching. He was waiting. His steely eyes scanned the lines, looking for the number A7713, for the butterfly he intended to pin to his collection. He intended to let the march begin, to let her leave the relative safety of the crowd, then grab her on the deserted road. She had only a few minutes. Taking advantage of the jostling, she broke away from the line, slipping into the shadows between the buildings, and ran toward the infirmary. It was nearly empty. In a back room, Ilara and two others were waiting. The light from an oil lamp illuminated a horrifying sight. On makeshift beds lay the bodies of 3 prisoners who had just died of typhus. "Kressler is afraid of disease," Ilara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He wouldn't touch anything that was contaminated." She approached a body, using a rag to soak up the dead man's bodily fluids and blood. Then she handed the damp, foul-smelling rag to the girl. That was their plan. A final act. An all-out gamble that would use Kressler's own obsession against him. The Germans. Footsteps and shouts were getting closer, searching the last buildings. "He wants a preserved specimen," Ilara said, her eyes boring into the girl's, both a command and a plea. "Give him something rotten." The girl stood there, holding the rag, a literal object of death. To escape, she would have to do more than just feign death. She would have to don the cloak of the very disease her enemies feared most. Outside, the SS boots were closing in. The decision had to be made immediately. Would she smear herself with death to win life? Or would she be captured like a perfect butterfly in Kressler's glass cage? Continue. Next. Show thinking. Continue. There was no time for disgust. There was only life and death. She closed her eyes and pressed the cold, damp rag to her forehead, her cheeks, her neck. The stench of disease and decay filled her nostrils, but she did not retreat. Elara helped her onto an empty bed between two bodies, pulling the dirty, tattered blanket up to her chin. "Don't breathe," Elara whispered before retreating into a dark corner. The door was kicked open. 2 SS men burst in, guns pointed. Kressler followed them. He walked, not like a soldier but like a collector, entering his archives for the last time. His gaze swept the room, past the bodies on the other beds, and stopped at her. He moved closer. She could smell the leather of his gloves, the expensive aftershave, a sickening insult in this house of death. She forced herself to lie still, but she could feel her heart trying to break through her ribcage. He stood over her, his shadow blocking the flickering oil lamp. He was studying her, possessiveness battling the primal fear in his eyes. He wanted confirmation. She knew this was the decisive moment. Summoning all her remaining strength, she let out a weak moan, a rumble deep in her chest, and a slight spasm ran through her body. It was a perfect display of the final moments. It broke Kressler's control. He took a step back, then another, his face contorted with disgust. His obsession with purity, his fear of contamination, had finally won out. Loss was written all over his face, the fury of a collector whose most precious item had been stolen from him. He had lost. "Verbrennen Sie die ganze Baracke!" he roared to his men. "Burn this whole building!" He turned on his heel and stormed from the room, unwilling to breathe another second of the poisonous air. He would rather burn his treasures than risk contamination. The 2 soldiers began pouring kerosene on the floor, but at that moment, a deafening explosion rang out from very close by, shaking the entire building. Red Army artillery. An officer from outside shouted a new order, an urgent retreat. During the soldiers' hesitation, Elara rushed out of the darkness. "Now!" she shouted. She pulled the girl up, and they and the other 2 rushed to the back window. They broke through the flimsy wooden planks and jumped out. Just as the first flames began to lick at the dry wooden wall, they ran. They ran across the deserted farmyard, past the barbed wire that had been cut at a weak point the network had identified months ago, and into the snow-covered woods. They were no longer numbers, they were ghosts in a dying world. Behind them, Auschwitz was engulfed in flames and chaos. Before them lay the harsh Polish winter, a no-man's land filled with disintegrating armies and a frightened and hostile local population. Freedom did not taste sweet. It tasted of melting snow and fear. For weeks they hid, traveling at night, surviving on what they could find, sheltered by a few brave peasants who risked their lives for them. Elara, with her medical knowledge, kept the girl alive through the fever and infection brought on by the horror of the scene. In the end, when the war ended, the girl was no longer A7713, but she was no longer the bookish girl from Amsterdam either. She was something else, forged in the fire, shaped by loss and silent resistance. Her revenge was not to see Kressler hanged. He had disappeared into the chaos of the war, perhaps dead, perhaps escaped with a new identity. Her true revenge was the fact that he had failed. The butterflies in her mind were still alive, still fluttering. In the heavy silence of the post-war world, when so many wanted to forget, she did something few could have imagined. She began to speak. Not about Kressler, not about the hunt. That would be her own secret, a burden she carried. She spoke of the machine, of the system, of the millions who had been reduced to dust. She became a witness. Every testimony was an act of resistance. Every shared memory was a brick in the wall against forgetting. She survived not just to tell the story of how people die. She survived to tell the story of how an idea, a legacy, a catalog of black butterflies can be kept safe in the last and most impregnable fortress, the human mind. Her fight never ended. It simply shifted from a fight for survival to a fight for memory, a silent, lonely fight that would last until her last breath.